Completely stupid medieval trends that got people killed. Most people romanticize the medieval world. They imagine knights in shining armor, majestic castles rising above green hills, grand feasts lit by candlelight, and noble warriors fighting for honor. Movies have painted the Middle Ages as an age of chivalry and bravery. But the truth is far less glamorous. The medieval period was filled with trends, yes, trends, that were not just strange, not just uncomfortable, but completely stupid and often deadly. And the worst part? People followed them willingly. Not because they were forced, not because they had no choice, but because everyone else was doing it. In an age without modern science, without germ theory, without reliable medicine, people believed in ideas that today would sound absolutely insane. Fashion trends that slowly poisoned the body. Medical treatments that guaranteed death. Social rituals that spread disease faster than wildfire. Religious practices that encouraged physical harm. Even beauty standards that literally suffocated people. And these weren't rare mistakes. They were normal. Let's start with one of the most absurd and deadly fashion trends of medieval Europe: extreme pointed shoes. In the 14th and 15th centuries, something bizarre took over European fashion. Nobles began wearing shoes called Poulaines. These shoes had incredibly long, pointed toes. And when I say long, I don't mean slightly extended. I mean absurdly long. Some extended up to 2 feet beyond the wearer's actual foot. Why? Because longer meant richer. The length of your shoe pointed directly reflected your social status. The more exaggerated the point, the more powerful you appeared. Kings and high-ranking nobles wore the longest ones. Some even stuffed the tips with moss or horsehair to maintain their shape. Others tied the tips to their knees with strings so they wouldn't trip. And yes, people did trip. Frequently. In crowded streets filled with mud, animal waste, and uneven stones, wearing shoes that prevented you from walking properly was already dangerous. But during times of war, it became deadly. Soldiers who wore these fashionable shoes struggled to move effectively in battle. There are accounts suggesting that in certain conflicts, men had to cut off the front of their own shoes mid-combat just to run properly. Imagine going into a fight where survival depends on speed and choosing fashion instead. Even worse, the shoes caused permanent foot deformities, cramped toes, infections, ingrown nails, and wounds that easily became infected in a time before antibiotics. A small cut could turn septic. Sepsis could mean death. And all of this for a pointed shoe. But if you think that's ridiculous, wait until you hear about medieval bloodletting. For centuries, one of the most popular medical treatments in medieval Europe was bloodletting. The idea came from ancient Greek theories about the 4 humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. According to this belief system, illness was caused by an imbalance of these fluids. So what was the solution? Remove blood. A lot of it. Doctors would cut open veins or apply leeches to drain what they believed was excess blood. It didn't matter what the illness was. Fever? Remove blood. Infection? Remove blood. Weakness? Remove blood. Plague? Definitely remove blood. The logic was simple and disastrously wrong. In reality, sick people were already weak. Their bodies were fighting infection. And medieval doctors were draining the very thing that carried oxygen and immune cells. Bloodletting didn't cure disease. It accelerated death. Many patients likely died not from their original illness, but from massive blood loss, severe anemia, shock, organ failure. But because medicine was poorly understood, if a patient died, it was often believed that the illness was simply too strong, not that the treatment caused it. Even kings were subjected to this. In fact, one of the most famous examples was King Charles II of Spain. When he fell ill, physicians drained him repeatedly in an attempt to balance his humors. Instead, they weakened him further. Bloodletting was so popular that barber surgeons performed it regularly. That's actually why the classic barber pole has red and white stripes. The red symbolized blood. The white symbolized bandages. Imagine going to get a haircut and leaving with a vein sliced open. And yet people trusted it. Now let's talk about something even more horrifying: the obsession with pale skin. In medieval Europe, pale skin meant wealth. It meant you didn't work outside. It meant you were high status. So women, and sometimes men, went to extreme lengths to make their skin as white as possible. One popular method involved applying lead-based cosmetics. Yes, lead. Lead-based face powders were used to create a ghostly white complexion. The problem? Lead is a poison, a powerful neurotoxin. Prolonged exposure causes hair loss, skin damage, neurological problems, and eventually death. But when women noticed their hair falling out or their skin deteriorating, they didn't blame the makeup. They applied more. Because if your skin started looking damaged, you needed more powder to hide it. It became a deadly cycle. The irony is brutal. In trying to look beautiful, people slowly poisoned themselves. And because the damage happened gradually, it wasn't always connected to the cosmetics. This wasn't until a rare practice either. Across Europe, the beauty standard encouraged toxic self-harm in the name of elegance. And then there was bathing, or rather, the lack of it. At certain points in the medieval period, especially after the Black Death, public bathing fell out of favor. People began believing that hot water opened the pores and allowed disease to enter the body. Bathhouses were closed. Hygiene declined dramatically. Instead of washing with water, people masked odors with heavy perfumes and herbs. Clothes were worn repeatedly without proper cleaning. Waste was thrown to streets. Animals roamed freely in cities. The result? Disease spread easily. When the Black Death struck Europe in the 14th century, killing millions, poor sanitation played a massive role. Fleas carrying plague bacteria thrived in dirty environments. Rats multiplied. Crowded cities with no sewage systems became death traps. But instead of improving hygiene, many communities doubled down on superstition. Some believed the plague was caused by bad air. Others believed it was divine punishment. Some even turned on minority groups, blaming them for poisoning wells. Very few understood the real cause. Ignorance wasn't just unfortunate. It was fatal. And this pattern repeats over and over throughout medieval history. Trends rooted in superstition, fashion driven by ego, medical practices based on flawed theories, social pressures stronger than common sense. Take the practice of wearing extremely heavy armor as a symbol of status. While armor was necessary for protection, some nobles exaggerated it for display, overly decorative, bulky pieces that limited movement. In tournaments, this sometimes resulted in knights overheating or suffocating inside their own gear. Heatstroke was real, and in full metal armor under the sun, it could be deadly. But prestige mattered more than practicality. Then there were trial by ordeal practices. If someone was accused of a crime, they might be forced to hold a hot iron or plunge their hand into boiling water. The belief was that God would protect the innocent from harm. Spoiler, burns don't care about innocence. If the wound healed cleanly, you were declared innocent. If it became infected, you were guilty. In a world without antiseptics, burns almost always became infected. So many people were effectively condemned by bacteria. And yet, it was considered divine justice. It's easy for us to look back and feel superior. to laugh at pointed shoes and bloodletting and toxic makeup. But at the time, these practices were normal. They were accepted. They were reinforced by authority figures, doctors, nobles, clergy, which makes it even more chilling, because it shows how powerful social pressure can be, how dangerous misinformation can become when it's institutionalized, how quickly a bad idea can turn into a deadly tradition. Because medieval Europe also saw dangerous food preservation techniques, deadly tournament spectacles, bizarre medical cures involving mercury, and even architectural trends that led to catastrophic collapses. The Middle Ages weren't just brutal because of wars and invasions. They were brutal because of fashion, because of medicine, because of belief, because of trends. And some of those trends cost thousands of lives. If there's one thing the medieval world was exceptionally confident about, it was being completely wrong about medicine. And one of the most disturbingly popular cures involved mercury. Yes, the same metallic element we now know is highly toxic to the human body. In medieval Europe, mercury was considered powerful. It was mysterious. It was shiny. It moved like liquid silver. To alchemists, it symbolized transformation. To physicians, it symbolized healing. To the human body, it symbolized disaster. Mercury was widely used to treat skin diseases, especially syphilis. When syphilis began spreading across Europe in the late 15th century, doctors panicked. The disease caused painful sores, neurological damage, insanity, and death. And in their desperation, they turned to mercury. Patients were rubbed with mercury ointments. They inhaled mercury vapors in sealed sweating boxes. Some were even given mercury to ingest. The logic was that mercury would purge the body of disease. What it actually did was poison the nervous system. Victims experienced drooling, tooth loss, trembling hands, hallucinations, kidney damage, and severe psychological breakdowns. There was even a saying at the time, a night with Venus, a lifetime with Mercury, meaning you might get syphilis from a romantic encounter and spend the rest of your life being poisoned by its treatment. Many patients likely died not from syphilis itself, but from mercury toxicity. And yet the treatment continued for centuries. Because once a trend is accepted as scientific truth, it becomes very hard to question. Now let's talk about tournaments. Medieval tournaments were supposed to be controlled displays of knightly skill, jousting matches, swordplay competitions, demonstrations of bravery. In theory, they were entertainment. In practice, they were incredibly dangerous. Jousting involved two armored knights charging at each other on horseback with long wooden lances. The goal was to knock your opponent off his horse. But here's the problem. You're riding at full speed, in heavy armor, holding a weapon, aiming directly at another human being. Even a small miscalculation could be fatal. Lances shattered. Wood splintered. Shards pierced visors and throats. Horses collided. Knights were crushed under thousands of pounds of metal and animal weight. One of the most famous examples was King Henry II of France. During a jousting tournament in 1559, a splinter from his opponent's lance pierced through his visor and into his eye. He suffered for days before dying from the injury. All because of a sporting event. And this wasn't rare. Tournaments were so dangerous that several rulers attempted to ban them. The church even condemned them at times. But nobles loved them. They were glamorous, they were dramatic, they reinforced social hierarchy. So they continued. And men kept dying for applause. But if tournaments were risky for nobles, everyday life was often worse for common people. Take medieval architecture. Cathedrals and castles were built on massive scales. Gothic cathedrals reached breathtaking heights. Builders pushed the limits of engineering without modern calculations or materials. And sometimes they guessed wrong. Towers collapsed. Scaffolding failed. Workers fell from incredible heights. Stone blocks slipped and crushed laborers below. Construction sites were incredibly hazardous. There were no hard hats, no safety harnesses, no structural simulations. In some cases, parts of cathedrals collapsed years after completion because foundations were misjudged. The drive to build higher and more magnificent structures sometimes outpaced actual engineering knowledge. Faith and ambition replaced physics. And physics always wins. Then there were fire hazards. Medieval cities were basically waiting to burn. Most buildings were made of wood. Roofs were thatched with dry straw. Houses were packed tightly together. Open flames were used constantly for cooking, heating, and lighting. And when a fire started, it spread like a nightmare. One candle knocked over, one kitchen accident, one unattended hearth. Entire neighborhoods could be gone in hours. There were no professional fire departments. Buckets of water passed hand to hand were often the only defense. In crowded cities, fires killed thousands over the centuries. But even after devastating blazes, cities were often rebuilt in the same way, because tradition mattered more than safety. Now let's discuss food. Medieval preservation techniques were limited. Without refrigeration, people relied on salting, smoking, or drying meat. But these methods weren't always effective. Improperly preserved food led to botulism and severe food poisoning. Grain stored in damp conditions grew toxic molds. Ergot fungus contaminated rye, causing hallucinations, convulsions, and sometimes death. There are theories that entire episodes of demonic possession or mass hysteria may have actually been ergot poisoning. Imagine eating bread and suddenly experiencing terrifying visions, muscle spasms, and burning sensations in your limbs. In a deeply religious society, those symptoms weren't attributed to fungus. They were attributed to demons. And that misunderstanding shaped real consequences. Which brings us to another deadly medieval trend: flagellation. During times of crisis, especially during the Black Death, groups of people known as flagellants traveled from town to town publicly whipping themselves. They believed the plague was God's punishment, and the only way to appease him was through suffering. So they beat themselves in public squares. They tore open their own backs. They bled. They scarred themselves permanently. Crowds gathered. Some joined. The movement spread. Ironically, these traveling groups likely helped spread disease further as they moved between towns. What was meant to save souls may have helped spread death, but in their minds it was righteous. And that's what makes medieval trends so fascinating and terrifying at the same time. They weren't random acts of stupidity. They were socially reinforced beliefs. Entire communities agreeing on ideas that were objectively dangerous. Now let's talk about childbirth. In the medieval period, childbirth was one of the leading causes of death for women. Hygiene was minimal. Medical knowledge was limited. Midwives worked without sterilized tools. Infections were common. Complications were often fatal, and in some regions, superstitions made things worse. Certain herbs used during childbirth were ineffective or harmful. Some practices delayed necessary intervention because complications were seen as divine will. Maternal mortality was staggeringly high, yet having many children was socially expected. Women risked their lives repeatedly because that was the norm, and the risk wasn't theoretical. It was constant. Now here's something even more disturbing. In some parts of medieval Europe, animal trials were a real thing. If a pig killed a child, the pig could be arrested, tried in court, and publicly executed. It sounds absurd, but it reflects a deeper pattern. The need to assign moral blame to everything, even animals. Instead of addressing structural issues like why livestock roamed freely in crowded towns, communities staged elaborate legal proceedings against animals. Energy was spent on symbolic justice instead of practical safety. Which brings us back to the core truth. The medieval world wasn't just dangerous because it lacked technology. It was dangerous because it clung to ideas. Ideas about medicine. Ideas about beauty. Ideas about justice. Ideas about religion. Ideas about status. And once those ideas became tradition, they were defended fiercely, even when people died. Even when evidence piled up. Even when common sense quietly whispered that something was wrong. Tradition can be powerful. Powerful enough to override survival instincts. And the Middle Ages prove that again and again. If there's one thing medieval society took seriously, it was beauty. Not comfort, not safety, not long-term survival. Beauty. And one of the strangest beauty standards of the late Middle Ages involved foreheads. Yes, foreheads. In certain parts of Europe, especially during the 14th and 15th centuries, a high, wide forehead was considered incredibly attractive. It symbolized intelligence, nobility, refinement. So women began altering their natural hairlines. They plucked them, not just shaping their eyebrows. They plucked the front of their scalp, hairline by hairline, strand by strand. Women painfully removed hair to push their hairline further back. Some even shaved it entirely. The goal was to create the illusion of an elongated skull. Now, on the surface, this might not sound deadly, but remember the conditions. There were no sterilized tools, no antiseptics, no clean environments. Repeated plucking caused small, open wounds along the scalp. Infections were common. And in a time when even a minor infection could turn into something fatal, what began as a cosmetic adjustment could escalate quickly. Skin infections could spread. Abscesses could form. Sepsis could develop. All because society decided that a larger forehead looked elegant. But beauty didn't stop at hairlines. Let's talk about toxic pigments. Medieval artists and clothing makers loved vibrant colors. Bright reds, deep greens, rich yellows. These colors symbolized wealth and power. The brighter the dye, the more impressive the garment. The problem? Many of those pigments were poisonous. One particularly deadly pigment was made using arsenic. Arsenic-based greens became fashionable in later medieval and early Renaissance periods. Clothing dyed in these shades could slowly poison the wearer, especially if the fabric was worn frequently or absorbed sweat. Then there were cosmetics containing toxic compounds, and painters who licked their brushes to get a fine point, unknowingly ingesting heavy metals daily. Long-term exposure led to mysterious illnesses, chronic pain, organ failure, neurological decline. But people didn't connect the dots, because fashion mattered. Status mattered. And slow poisoning wasn't as dramatic as a sword wound. It was quiet, gradual, invisible, which made it even more dangerous. Now let's move to something that combined religion, endurance, and sheer recklessness: pilgrimages. In medieval Europe, pilgrimages were seen as acts of devotion. People traveled hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles to reach sacred sites, places like Santiago de Compostela, Rome, or Jerusalem. The journey itself was considered spiritually cleansing, but these journeys were brutal. Travelers walked on dangerous roads infested with bandits. They crossed rivers without safe bridges. They slept outdoors, exposed to cold and disease. Food and water were often contaminated. Medical help was almost non-existent. Many never returned. Some died from illness, some from robbery, some from exhaustion. And yet people kept going, because faith promised salvation. In some cases, entire groups would set out together. When disease struck one member, it spread quickly through the group. Close quarters, poor hygiene, shared food. What began as a spiritual journey could become a moving epidemic. Now imagine doing this during a time like the Black Death. And yes, people did. Another deadly medieval trend was the belief in miasma, the idea that disease spread through bad air. When plague outbreaks occurred, people focused on smells. They carried fragrant herbs, they burned incense. They wore beak-like masks filled with aromatic plants in later centuries. But they ignored what truly spread disease: bacteria, fleas, contaminated environments. Because they believed the air was the enemy, they didn't prioritize sanitation. They didn't isolate effectively in early outbreaks. They didn't understand vectors. So while they were busy fighting invisible bad smells, the real cause multiplied freely. This misunderstanding cost millions to lives. Then there's something even darker: judicial torture. Confession was considered the ultimate proof of guilt. And if someone wouldn't confess voluntarily, torture was used to extract it. Stretching devices, crushing tools, sleep deprivation, psychological torment. The logic was terrifyingly simple. An innocent person, protected by God, would withstand torture. A guilty person would confess. In reality, anyone will confess to anything under enough pain. This trend didn't just ruin lives, it ended them. Executions followed forced confessions. Entire communities were torn apart by accusations. And during times of panic, like plague years or periods of famine, fear intensified. Which leads us to witch hunts. In the later medieval period, and into the early modern era, belief in witchcraft turned deadly. Failed crops, witch, sick child, witch, unexplained death, witch. Accused individuals, often women, were subjected to brutal tests. Some were drowned to see if they would float. Some were burned. Some were tortured into confessions of impossible crimes. Mass hysteria became policy. Fear became law. Thousands died not because of magic, but because of paranoia reinforced by authority. Now let's talk about something less dramatic, but just as deadly: urban overcrowding. Medieval cities were growing. Trade expanded. Populations increased. But infrastructure didn't keep up. Narrow streets, shared wells, open sewage, livestock inside city walls. Human waste was often dumped directly outside homes, sometimes out of windows. Rivers became contaminated. Drinking water mixed with sewage. Cholera, dysentery, typhoid-like illnesses, though not fully understood at the time, thrived in these conditions. But rather than redesign cities for sanitation, many communities accepted the filth as normal, because that's how it had always been done. And always is a powerful word. Then there were execution spectacles. Public executions were considered entertainment. Crowds gathered, vendors sold food, families brought children. Hanging, beheading, burning, these were social events. But large crowds, packed tightly together in unsanitary urban centers, created perfect conditions for disease transmission. The very gatherings meant to reinforce order may have accelerated outbreaks. And still they continued. Over and over, the same pattern appears. A belief becomes popular. It becomes tradition. Tradition becomes identity. Identity resists change, even when the cost is human life. Now here's something chilling. In some medieval medical practices, skull fragments from executed criminals were ground into powder and used as medicine. It was believed that consuming parts of the human body could transfer vitality or cure epilepsy. This practice, sometimes called medicinal cannibalism, persisted for centuries in different forms. Imagine taking a remedy made from the remains of the executed. It sounds like horror fiction, but it was accepted because authority figures endorsed it, because people trusted experts, and because alternatives were limited. The medieval world wasn't filled with evil people. It was filled with people doing what they thought was right, following trends, trusting leaders, trying to survive. But when knowledge is flawed, when fear overrides reason, when status matters more than safety, entire societies can normalize self-destruction. And that's what makes these trends so haunting. They weren't rare accidents. They were cultural movements, and many of them quietly filled graves. We still have one more layer to uncover, because some medieval trends weren't just dangerous in life. They were dangerous in death. From burial practices that spread infection to bizarre corpse-related superstitions that triggered panic. Because some of the most dangerous trends didn't stop when people died. They began after death. During major plague outbreaks, especially the Black Death of the 14th century, burial practices collapsed under pressure. Cities were overwhelmed, graveyards filled beyond capacity. Priests died faster than they could administer last rites. Families were too afraid to handle bodies. So mass graves became common. Bodies were stacked quickly, sometimes without proper depth, sometimes without clear separation. In normal times, burial rituals were slow, sacred, careful. But during plague years, fear replaced ceremony. And here's the dangerous part. People didn't fully understand contagion, but they did understand fear. When multiple family members died in one house, neighbors panicked. Homes were abandoned. Sometimes belongings were looted. Sometimes houses were burned. In some regions, corpses were handled repeatedly during superstitious rituals meant to stop the plague. People believed certain bodies were responsible for spreading disease from beyond the grave. Suspected plague spreaders were exhumed, hearts removed, bodies burned again. These practices weren't based on science. They were based on terror. And while plague was primarily spread by fleas on rats, poor sanitation and panic-driven mass movement of people made everything worse. Burial grounds sometimes contaminated nearby water sources. Shallow graves allowed animals to disturb remains. Overcrowded cities with rotting corpses created psychological horror that amplified chaos. The handling of death itself became part of the crisis. Then there were corpse-related superstitions that caused even more harm. In parts of Eastern Europe during later medieval periods, fears of vampires emerged. When unexplained deaths occurred, villagers sometimes believed the dead were rising to harm the living. Graves were reopened, bodies were mutilated, stakes were driven through chests. Again, this wasn't random cruelty. It was an attempt to control what people didn't understand. Diseases like tuberculosis caused wasting symptoms. Victims grew pale, thin, and weak. Family members who later developed the illness might have seemed like they were being drained by the dead. Without medical knowledge, supernatural explanations filled the void. And fear justified almost anything. Now let's shift to something that feels smaller but wasn't. Medieval dentistry. Toothaches were common. Sugar consumption began increasing among wealthier classes. Oral hygiene was minimal. When pain struck, the solution was brutal. Teeth were pulled, Often without anesthesia, often with crude metal tools, often by barber surgeons or traveling practitioners. Infections were common afterward. Without antibiotics, a dental abscess could spread into the bloodstream. Something that today might require a routine procedure could become fatal. Even worse, some treatments involved applying harmful substances to gums in an attempt to kill the worms they believed caused tooth decay. Yes, many medieval people thought toothaches were caused by worms inside the teeth. So they used chemicals or heated tools to drive the worms out. The worms didn't exist. The damage did. Then there was diet. For peasants especially, food variety was limited. Malnutrition weakened immune systems. During famines, desperation led people to consume spoiled grain, diseased animals, or toxic plants. One recurring problem was ergot-contaminated rye. Ergot fungus produced toxins that caused convulsions, burning sensations in limbs, gangrene, and hallucinations. Entire villages could suffer outbreaks of what was called St. Anthony's fire. Limbs turned black. Fingers fell off. People screamed from internal burning sensations. Without understanding the fungus, communities interpreted these episodes as divine punishment or demonic attack. Sometimes they prayed. Sometimes they panicked. But they kept eating the same grain because there was nothing else. Another overlooked but deadly medieval trend was the obsession with humoral balance in everyday life. It wasn't just medicine. Diet was regulated according to humor theory. People avoided certain foods in certain seasons. Some avoided fruits, believing they caused dangerous imbalances. Others consumed extreme amounts of particular meats to correct perceived deficiencies. The problem wasn't always immediate death. It was chronic weakness. Nutritional misunderstandings stacked on top of poor sanitation, stacked on top of primitive medicine, stacked on top of social pressure. And the human body can only endure so much. Let's talk about warfare traditions. Sieges were common in medieval Europe. When armies surrounded cities, starvation became a weapon. But inside the city walls, desperation led to horrifying conditions. Food ran out. Water sources became contaminated. Disease spread rapidly in cramped quarters. In some sieges, historical records describe outbreaks so severe that more people died from disease and starvation than from combat. Yet siege warfare remained a standard strategy for centuries because it worked, even if it meant slow suffering for thousands. And then there's the obsession with honor. Duels, feuds, retaliatory violence between families. These weren't just spontaneous conflicts. They were culturally reinforced expectations. If your honor was insulted, you responded. If your family was wronged, you retaliated. Cycles of violence escalated quickly. Minor disputes turned into deadly clashes, because backing down meant weakness. And weakness threatened survival in a rigid social hierarchy. So pride killed. Not instantly, but steadily. And through all of this, one theme repeats louder than anything else. Information was limited. Authority was rarely questioned. Tradition outweighed evidence. People trusted what they inherited. And inherited beliefs can be deadly. It's easy to look back and call medieval trends stupid. To shake our heads at pointed shoes and Mercury cures and witch trials. But what makes it truly unsettling is realizing that the people living then were intelligent by the standards of their time. They weren't foolish. They were trapped inside incomplete knowledge systems. They did what their leaders said, what their doctors recommended, what their religion instructed, what their neighbors practiced. And when everyone around you believes something, it feels safe, even if it isn't. The Middle Ages were brutal, yes. But not just because of invasions or barbaric rulers. They were brutal because misinformation was powerful, because social pressure was overwhelming, because questioning authority was dangerous, because survival often depended on conformity. Fashion trends deformed bodies, medical trends drained life, religious trends inflicted pain, judicial trends destroyed the innocent, urban trends spread disease, and each one at some point was considered normal. That's the chilling part. Normal. Entire generations lived and died inside systems that quietly harmed them. And if there's one lesson buried inside all of this medieval madness, it's this. A bad idea repeated long enough becomes tradition. Tradition defended long enough becomes identity. And identity, once threatened, resists change, even when change could save lives. The Middle Ages weren't just a dark time because of swords and plagues. They were dark because of belief. And belief, when wrong, can be deadlier than any weapon ever forged. We've walked through poison disguised as medicine. Fashion disguised as status. Faith twisted by fear. Tradition defended at the cost of human life. Because some medieval trends didn't just kill individuals. They reshaped entire generations. Let's talk about childhood. In many parts of medieval Europe, children weren't viewed the way we see them today. Childhood wasn't considered a long, protected stage of development. Once a child could walk, talk, and perform simple tasks, they were often treated as small adults. By the age of 7, many children were working. On farms, in workshops, in kitchens, in mines. Yes, mines. Mining was one of the most dangerous occupations of the medieval world. Narrow tunnels, poor ventilation, toxic gases, cave-ins, and children were sent into spaces too small for adults. No protective equipment, no understanding of long-term lung damage, no safety regulation. Some suffocated, some were crushed. Some slowly developed respiratory illnesses that would shorten their lives dramatically. And it wasn't considered cruel. It was considered normal. Because survival demanded labor. Now let's talk about apprenticeships. Young boys were often sent away from home to live with masters. Blacksmiths, bakers, tailors. While many masters were responsible, others were brutal. Physical punishment was common. Harsh discipline was expected. In a society where violence was normalized, abuse could easily hide inside training. Again, not rare, normal. And then there were arranged marriages at shockingly young ages. Particularly among nobility, girls could be married off in their early teens, sometimes younger, for political alliances. Pregnancy at such a young age dramatically increased the risk of death in childbirth. Pelvic development incomplete. Medical care primitive. Infections rampant. Many young brides never reached adulthood. But alliances mattered more than biology. Now let's shift to something that seems almost absurd, but carried real danger. Alchemy. The medieval obsession with turning base metals into gold wasn't just philosophical. Alchemists experimented with chemicals constantly. They heated substances in poorly ventilated rooms. They mixed unknown compounds. They inhaled toxic fumes. Explosions happen. Poisonings happen. Fires happen. And because alchemy blended science with mysticism, practitioners often believed they were on the brink of divine discovery. Instead, many were slowly poisoning themselves with arsenic, sulfur, mercury, and lead. Curiosity without chemistry knowledge can be lethal. Now consider medieval warfare technology experimentation. Early gunpowder weapons began appearing toward the end of the medieval period. Cannons were unpredictable. Poorly cast metal barrels sometimes exploded upon firing. Soldiers operating these early weapons were essentially standing next to experimental bombs. Misfires could tear through friendly ranks. Shrapnel could fly in every direction. But military advantage outweighed safety concerns. Test first, refine later. Bury the casualties in between. And what about daily domestic life? Cooking over open flames indoors without proper ventilation led to smoke inhalation. Long-term exposure damaged lungs. Combined with already weak immune systems, respiratory illness was common. Lighting came from candles and oil lamps. One spark, one careless movement. Entire wooden homes turned to ash. And yet alternatives didn't exist, or weren't prioritized. Then there's the psychological environment of the medieval world, something we rarely consider. Constant exposure to death, public executions, disease outbreaks, infant mortality, war. When death is everywhere, risk feels smaller. If you've already buried sibling, if your neighbors die every winter, if plague can take half a town in months, wearing toxic makeup might not seem that dangerous. Jousting might not seem that reckless. Draining blood might not seem that extreme. When mortality is normal, risk tolerance increases. That's one of the quiet, invisible trends of the medieval period. Desensitization. And desensitization can be deadly. Because when danger feels ordinary, you stop questioning it. Now here's something deeply ironic. The medieval world also produced incredible advancements. Architecture, philosophy, early universities, mechanical clocks, agricultural innovations. Human intelligence was there. Potential was there. But progress was constantly slowed by rigid systems of belief. If a respected authority said bloodletting worked, few challenged it. If tradition said bathing was unhealthy, few argued. If a priest declared a comet a sign of doom, panic followed. Information moved slowly. Correction moved slower. And mistakes lasted generations. Some trends faded only after catastrophic loss. The Black Death forced labor reforms. Repeated fire disasters slowly improved urban planning. Medical disasters eventually encouraged scientific inquiry. But those lessons were written in graves. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Every era has its medieval trends. Ideas that seem normal, practices widely accepted, beliefs fiercely defended. History doesn't just show us how foolish the past was. It warns us how powerful collective belief can be. The people of the Middle Ages weren't stupid. They were human, just like us. They wanted beauty, health, faith, status, security. But when knowledge is incomplete and authority is unquestioned, good intentions can create deadly systems. Pointed shoes crippled mobility. Mercury destroyed nervous systems. Lead cosmetics poisoned beauty. Flagellation spread disease. Witch hunts executed the innocent. Unsanitary cities amplified plague. Honor culture fueled endless violence. Child labor stole futures. Alchemy suffocated curiosity in toxic fumes. None of these started as deliberate self-destruction. They began as solutions, as symbols, as traditions, as faith. And they became lethal through repetition. That's the real story of medieval stupidity. Not ignorance alone, but the stubborn refusal to abandon harmful norms. The Middle Ages were not just an era of swords and castles. They were an era of trends. Trends that quietly, slowly, relentlessly got people killed. And perhaps the most chilling part of all, many of those people believed they were doing exactly what they were supposed to do. Following the rules, following the culture, following the wisdom of their time. History doesn't just record what happened, it asks a question. If we lived then, would we have questioned any of it? Or would we have worn the pointed shoes, trusted the Mercury cure, joined the crowd at the execution, and believed, completely, that it was normal? That's what makes medieval trends so terrifying. not how strange they were, but how ordinary they felt. If we're going to keep peeling this back, we have to confront something even heavier. Because some medieval trends didn't just kill through poison, infection, or violence. They killed through silence. Let's talk about mental health. In the medieval world, psychological disorders were rarely understood as medical conditions. Depression, schizophrenia, epilepsy, severe anxiety, these weren't seen through a biological lens. They were seen as spiritual problems. Possession, moral weakness, divine punishment. If someone heard voices, they might be accused of demonic influence. If someone withdrew socially or displayed erratic behavior, they might be feared. In extreme cases, individuals were restrained, isolated, or subjected to religious treatments meant to expel spirits. Exorcisms could be physically intense. Fasting was sometimes forced. Isolation could last long periods. Instead of therapy, there was suspicion. Instead of treatment, there was stigma. And when fear drives response, compassion often disappears. Now consider epilepsy. Today we understand seizures as neurological events. In medieval Europe, seizures were frequently interpreted as supernatural. Some communities treated sufferers with reverence. Others treated them with fear. Without proper care, people with seizure disorders were at constant risk, falling into fires, downstairs, into water. A condition that today can often be managed was, back then, life-threatening in ways that had nothing to do with the seizure itself, but everything to do with misunderstanding. Then there's famine culture. Medieval agriculture depended heavily on weather. A single bad harvest could ripple into disaster. But here's the dangerous trend. Monocropping. In many regions, communities relied too heavily on one or two staple grains. If those failed because of frost, flood, or fungus, the food supply collapsed. Diversification wasn't common practice. And when famine hit, desperation reshaped society. Crime increased. Disease spread. Malnutrition weakened immune systems. In extreme cases, there are historical accounts of people consuming grass, bark, even leather to survive. Famine didn't just kill through starvation. It made populations vulnerable to every other threat. Another overlooked medieval danger was the belief in astrology as a guiding medical tool. Physicians often consulted planetary alignments before performing treatments. Certain procedures were avoided during specific lunar phases. Surgeries were timed according to zodiac charts. Imagine delaying urgent medical intervention because Mars was in the wrong house. When celestial interpretation overrides immediate need, outcomes suffer. And yet astrology was considered advanced knowledge. It wasn't fringe. It was institutional. Let's talk about sanitation again, but from a different angle. Chamber pots were emptied into streets. Animal carcasses sometimes left to rot nearby. Tanneries dumped chemical waste into rivers. But the real danger wasn't just the filth. It was normalization of filth. When a child grows up stepping over waste daily, it becomes background scenery. When foul smells are constant, they stop registering as warnings. Humans adapt quickly, sometimes too quickly. And adaptation to unhealthy environments can shorten lifespans without anyone realizing why. Now consider medical education. Early universities in medieval Europe studied medicine, but much of it relied heavily on ancient texts, especially Galen. For centuries, his anatomical teachings were rarely questioned. The problem? Galen dissected animals, not humans. Some of his anatomical descriptions were incorrect, but challenging them meant challenging authority. And authority was not easily challenged. So errors were repeated, copied, taught, defended, for generations. When knowledge becomes sacred, it stops evolving, and stagnation in medicine costs lives. Then there's something else, something psychological. The medieval fascination with relics, bones of saints, fragments of the true cross, holy objects believed to heal. Pilgrims traveled vast distances to touch these relics. Crowds gathered tightly around them. People kissed them, pressed them to their faces. In times of disease outbreak, these gatherings became perfect transmission events. Faith drew crowds. Crowds spread illness. And because any resulting sickness could be interpreted as divine will, the practice continued, even as people fell ill afterward. Let's also talk about punishment culture. Prisons, as we understand them, were rare in early medieval Europe. Punishments were often corporal or capital: whipping, branding, mutilation. Cutting off hands for theft, blinding for certain crimes, public humiliation in stocks. Aside from cruelty, there was a hidden danger: open wounds, unsanitary tools, no infection control. Punishments meant to enforce orders sometimes resulted in slow, painful deaths from infection. Justice wasn't just harsh. It was medically reckless. And yet, again, it was normalized. Perhaps one of the most tragic patterns of the medieval world was how slowly corrective information spread. Today, a medical breakthrough can travel globally in hours. Back then, knowledge moved at the speed of a horse. Even if one town discovered a better practice, improved hygiene, safer building techniques, more effective treatments, it might take decades for that knowledge to reach another region. Meanwhile, harmful traditions persisted uninterrupted. Entire lifetimes passed before improvements arrived. And so when we talk about stupid medieval trends, we're really talking about a web of interconnected systems. Limited scientific tools, slow communication, rigid hierarchy, deep religious authority, cultural pride, fear of change. None of these are inherently evil, but together they create an environment where dangerous ideas thrive. And perhaps the most haunting realization is this: most medieval people never knew they were living inside flawed systems. They believed they were doing their best, following wisdom, honoring tradition, protecting community. They didn't wake up thinking, "Today I will follow a trend that harms me." They woke up thinking they were living correctly. That's what makes it powerful. And that's what makes it unsettling. Because every era believes it has reached a reasonable understanding of the world. Every era has experts, authorities, consensus. And every era, without exception, has blind spots. The Middle Ages simply had more of them exposed by time. Pointed shoes, Mercury cures, witch hunts, mass graves, toxic cosmetics, starvation cycles, brutal punishments, rigid medical dogma. Each one feels absurd now. But one day, future generations may look back at parts of our time with the same disbelief. That's the quiet lesson beneath all this medieval chaos. Human beings don't need bad intentions to create deadly systems. They just need certainty. Certainty without evidence. Tradition without revision. Authority without accountability. The Middle Ages were not uniquely foolish. They were human. And that's what makes their deadly trends not just history, but a warning. If we're going to take this all the way to the end, then we have to confront the final, uncomfortable layer of medieval trends: power. Because many of the deadliest ideas didn't spread randomly. They were protected, enforced, profitable. Let's talk about medicine again, but this time from the perspective of control. Physicians in the medieval period were part of an elite class. University-trained doctors relied heavily on ancient authorities like Galen and Hippocrates. Their education was expensive. Their status was high. Their reputation depended on appearing knowledgeable. Now imagine you're a physician in 1400. Your entire credibility is built on humoral theory. Blood, phlegm, black bile, yellow bile. Bloodletting is one of your primary treatments. If someone suggests bloodletting is harmful, they're not just questioning a procedure. They're questioning your identity, your education, your authority. So what happens? You defend the system. Not necessarily because you're evil, but because your position depends on it. And when authority defends a flawed system, reform slows to a crawl. That's how dangerous trends survive for centuries. Now let's talk about armor and warfare again, but from the economic side. Blacksmiths, armorers, weaponsmiths, entire industries depended on conflict culture. Honor-based duels, tournaments, military campaigns, noble rivalry. Violence wasn't just tradition, it was economy. When war is profitable, peace becomes complicated. And when honor culture fuels conflict, young men grow up believing glory is found on battlefields. Thousands died chasing reputation, because reputation was currency. Another deeply dangerous medieval trend was the persecution of marginalized groups during crises. During the Black Death, Jewish communities across parts of Europe were falsely accused of poisoning wells. Massacres followed, entire neighborhoods destroyed. Why? Fear. When people don't understand catastrophe, they look for a target. And once a narrative spreads, especially if endorsed by leaders, it becomes deadly very quickly. The plague killed millions, but panic killed thousands more. And here's the darker truth. Blame can feel safer than uncertainty. It's psychologically easier to believe someone caused disaster than to accept randomness. So societies invent villains, and those inventions cost real lives. Now consider something less dramatic but equally destructive: rigid class hierarchy. Medieval Europe was structured around strict social divisions. Peasants, serfs, nobles, clergy. Mobility was limited, opportunity constrained. Serfs were tied to land. They couldn't simply leave for better conditions. If a lord mismanaged resources, peasants suffered. If food was scarce, peasants starved first. The system wasn't designed for resilience. It was designed for stability. And stability, when too rigid, becomes fragile. When plague wiped out massive portions of the population, labor shortages followed. Suddenly, peasants had leverage. Some demanded better wages. In response, laws were passed in certain regions to freeze wages at pre-plague levels. Imagine surviving a pandemic, only to be legally prevented from improving your life afterward. Policy decisions prolonged suffering, not out of stupidity alone, but out of fear of losing control. Now let's address something psychological again: normalization of violence as entertainment. We mentioned public executions, but it went deeper. Bear baiting, animal fights, gladiatorial remnants in certain regions. Public punishments meant to humiliate. When violence becomes spectacle, empathy dulls. And when empathy dulls, policy becomes harsher. A culture comfortable watching suffering may become comfortable enforcing it. Over time, brutality embeds itself into identity. Then there's something almost invisible: the fear of innovation. In many medieval communities, radical change was suspicious. New ideas threatened established order. Printing technology, when it emerged in the late medieval period, was revolutionary precisely because it disrupted controlled knowledge flow. Before widespread printing, information was power, and power was centralized. When information is controlled, error persists longer, because fewer people can challenge it. That's why some dangerous trends didn't collapse under evidence. They collapsed under access. Access to knowledge, access to comparison, access to alternatives. And that took time. A lot of time. Now here's something important. Despite all this, the medieval world wasn't static darkness. It was transitional. It laid foundations for universities, for legal systems, for architectural innovation, for early scientific method. But progress came slowly, and often through tragedy. The Black Death reshaped labor structures. Repeated medical failures eventually encouraged anatomical dissection. Urban fires gradually influenced building reform. Improvement was reactive. Catastrophe first, reform second. And sometimes reform came too late for millions. So when we look back at completely stupid medieval trends that got people killed, what we're really seeing isn't just foolishness. We're seeing what happens when belief outruns evidence. Authority resists accountability. Tradition overpowers curiosity. Fear overrides compassion. Status eclipses safety. Pointed shoes weren't just shoes. They were symbols of status that ignored practicality. Mercury wasn't just medicine. It was desperation disguised as science. Witch hunts weren't just superstition. They were fear weaponized. Mass graves weren't just tragic necessity. They were reminders of how quickly systems collapse under strain. And here's the final uncomfortable reflection. The medieval world feels distant. Safe to criticize, easy to mock. But human psychology hasn't changed. We still follow trends, still trust authority, still defend systems we're invested in, still fear uncertainty, still sometimes choose identity over evidence. The difference today is speed. Information spreads faster. Correction spreads faster. But misinformation spreads faster too. The Middle Ages didn't have social media. They had pulpits, town criers, handwritten manuscripts. And those were powerful enough to shape reality for millions. So maybe the most dangerous medieval trend of all, final uncomfortable reflection. The medieval world feels distant. Safe to criticize, easy to mock. But human psychology hasn't changed. We still follow trends, still trust authority, still defend systems we're invested in, still fear uncertainty, still sometimes choose identity over evidence. The difference today is speed. Information spreads faster. Correction spreads faster. But misinformation spreads faster too. The Middle Ages didn't have social media. They had pulpits, town criers, handwritten manuscripts. And those were powerful enough to shape reality for millions. So maybe the most dangerous medieval trend of all wasn't bloodletting or toxic makeup or jousting. It was unquestioned certainty. Certainty that the system was correct. Certainty that leaders were right. Certainty that tradition equaled truth. That certainty built cathedrals. But it also built graves. And that's the full arc of it. The Middle Ages weren't a time of uniquely stupid people. They were a time of limited tools, powerful hierarchies, slow information, and deeply human instincts. And when those forces combine, deadly trends don't feel deadly. They feel normal, which might be the most terrifying lesson history has to offer. If we're truly going to close this chapter properly, then we need to step back and look at the medieval world not as a collection of strange events, but as a system. Because systems are what turn bad ideas into lethal traditions. And one of the most dangerous medieval trends wasn't physical at all. It was intellectual isolation. Medieval Europe, especially in its earlier centuries, was fragmented. Kingdoms divided by language, geography, religion, and politics. Travel was slow. communication unreliable. Knowledge didn't flow freely between cultures. Meanwhile, other parts of the world were making advances in mathematics, medicine, astronomy, and engineering. The Islamic Golden Age preserved and expanded upon Greek scientific texts. Scholars in parts of Asia developed sophisticated technologies, but information didn't always transfer quickly or completely. When cultures isolate themselves intellectually, they risk stagnation, and stagnation can be deadly. If one region develops a safer medical technique, but another never hears about it, preventable deaths continue. If agricultural innovation exists somewhere else but doesn't spread, famine persists. The medieval world was not just limited by ignorance. It was limited by barriers. And barriers are dangerous. Now let's talk about climate. Something medieval people couldn't control but often misunderstood. During parts of the medieval period, Europe experienced what's known as the medieval warm period, followed by the Little Ice Age. Crop yields fluctuated dramatically. Winters grew harsher in certain centuries. Harvest failures became more frequent. But instead of analyzing climate patterns scientifically, which would have required tools they didn't have, people interpreted extreme weather as divine messages. A long winter, God's anger. Floods, punishment. Drought, moral failure. This interpretation didn't just shape belief. It shaped policy. Rather than investing in agricultural diversification or structural resilience, communities sometimes focused on prayer, penance, or scapegoating. Spiritual response replaced structural adaptation. And when climate shifts continued, suffering compounded. Now let's examine something subtle but powerful: fatalism. When death is common, from disease, childbirth, war, famine, people begin to see it as inevitable. God's will. Fate. Destiny. Fatalism can bring comfort, but it can also discourage reform. If plague is God's plan, sanitation reform seems less urgent. If childbirth deaths are destiny, medical innovation feels secondary. If famine is punishment, agricultural experimentation seems irrelevant. When suffering is spiritualized, practical solutions can be delayed, and delay in high-risk environments is lethal. There's also the role of literacy. In much of medieval Europe, literacy rates were low outside clergy and elites. That meant most people relied on oral transmission for information. An oral transmission is powerful, but unstable. Rumors spread quickly. Details shift. Fear amplifies stories. In times of crisis, misinformation could travel faster than truth. Without widespread literacy, correcting falsehoods was incredibly difficult. And so myths persisted. Dangerous myths. Now consider the psychology of conformity. In tightly bound medieval communities, standing out was risky. If everyone believed a comet signaled doom, publicly disagreeing could make you suspicious. If everyone supported a witch accusation, defending the accused might turn attention toward you. Conformity wasn't just social. It was survival. And when survival depends on blending in, people often suppress doubt. That suppression allows harmful trends to solidify. Over time, questioning becomes rare. And when questioning disappears, error multiplies. But here's the most important shift we need to make before we end this entire exploration. The medieval world was not uniquely irrational. It was operating within the best framework it had. Humoral theory made sense with the limited biological knowledge available. Miasma theory made sense before germ theory. Religious interpretation made sense in a world without meteorology or microbiology. People weren't choosing stupidity. They were choosing coherence. They wanted explanations. Humans always want explanations. And when data is scarce, belief fills the gaps. That's universal. The tragedy of medieval deadly trends wasn't that people were foolish. It was that their tools were insufficient. Insufficient microscopes, insufficient data, insufficient communication, insufficient scientific method. And in the absence of those tools, culture became the guide. But culture, without correction, can drift into danger. Pointed shoes became exaggerated because status competition escalates. Bloodletting persisted because tradition resists contradiction. Mercury cures spread because desperation seeks certainty. Witch hunts exploded because fear demands targets. Mass pilgrimages continued because faith overrides risk. Each trend followed a pattern. Belief, normalization, repetition, defense, consequence, and sometimes reform. But reform usually followed catastrophe. Now imagine living in that world. You don't know about bacteria. You don't know about oxygen transport in blood. You don't understand toxicology. You don't have anesthesia. You don't have antibiotics. You don't have reliable weather forecasting. You don't have rapid communication. You rely on what your community believes, because that's all you have. The medieval period wasn't a time of constant stupidity. It was a time of constant vulnerability. Vulnerability to disease, to misinformation, to authority, to climate, to hierarchy. And when vulnerability meets rigid tradition, deadly trends can flourish. That's the true lesson buried in all of this. The Middle Ages weren't dark because people were dim. They were dark because knowledge was dim. And once knowledge began to expand, through printing, scientific inquiry, anatomical study, global exchange, many of those deadly trends slowly faded, not overnight, but gradually. The shift from authority-based truth to evidence-based truth changed everything. And yet, even today, the tension remains. Authority versus evidence. Tradition versus revision. Fear versus curiosity. The medieval world reminds us that humans are incredibly adaptive, but also incredibly susceptible to shared illusions. And sometimes the most dangerous thing in any society isn't a weapon. It's a belief that no one feels safe questioning. That was the hidden killer of the Middle Ages. Not just plague, not just war, not just poison, but unquestioned belief amplified by fear and protected by power. That's how trends become fatal. And that's why history matters. Because when we study the medieval world closely, we're not just studying the past. We're studying ourselves. Let's bring this to its true ending. After everything we've uncovered, the poison cosmetics, the mercury cures, the bloodletting, the witch hunts, the famine cycles, the fatal pilgrimages, the rigid hierarchies, the unquestioned authorities. One truth stands above all of it. The most dangerous medieval trend wasn't fashion. It wasn't medicine. It wasn't even superstition. It was the habit of accepting danger as normal. That is what truly got people killed. Because once something becomes normal, it stops being examined. When pointed shoes crippled movement, they weren't seen as ridiculous. They were status. When bloodletting weakened the sick, it wasn't seen as harmful. It was treatment. When women died in childbirth, it wasn't seen as systemic failure. It was fate. When plague wiped out villages, it wasn't seen as sanitation collapse. It was divine will. Normal is powerful. Normal can silence doubt. Normal can override instinct. Normal can bury evidence. And medieval society was built on layers of normality that had never been scientifically stress-tested. But here's something important. Despite everything, despite the deadly trends, the ignorance, the fear, humanity did not stay frozen there. Curiosity survived. Doubt survived. Some people questioned. Some experimented. Some quietly observed that washing wounds helped, that quarantine slowed disease, that certain herbs worked better than others, that anatomy required direct study, not just ancient books. Progress did not explode into existence. It crawled forward, often resisted, often punished, often ignored. But it crawled forward anyway. And eventually, the grip of deadly traditions began to loosen. The scientific method emerged. Printing spread knowledge. Exploration connected cultures. Medical understanding expanded. The medieval world slowly gave way to something different. Not perfect, but improved. And that transition teaches us something vital. Human beings are not doomed to repeat deadly trends forever. But we are vulnerable to them. Because every generation believes it understands the world reasonably well. Every generation has its experts, its authorities, its social pressures, its fashionable ideas, its unquestioned norms. And every generation has blind spots. The people of the Middle Ages weren't sitting in darkness thinking, "We are ignorant." They believed they were living in truth. That's what makes this story so powerful. Deadly trends don't feel deadly while you're inside them. They feel justified. They feel intelligent. They feel moral. They feel necessary. Only hindsight makes them look absurd. So when we talk about completely stupid medieval trends that got people killed, we're not just listing bizarre practices. We're examining a warning pattern. A pattern that looks like this: limited knowledge, strong authority, cultural pressure, fear of uncertainty, resistance to change. Mix those together, and even intelligent societies can normalize harm. The Middle Ages were filled with courage, art, architecture, devotion, and resilience. But they were also filled with unquestioned habits that cost millions of lives. Not because people wanted death, but because they didn't yet have the tools to see the danger clearly. And maybe that's the final, uncomfortable takeaway. The medieval world feels distant enough for us to criticize safely. But the mechanism that created those deadly trends, that mechanism is timeless. Humans crave certainty. We follow leaders. We imitate peers. We protect identity. We resist change. If the medieval period teaches us anything, it's this: questioning is survival. Curiosity is protection. Evidence is defense. The moment a society stops questioning its own normal, it begins building invisible risks. And risks, when ignored long enough, turn into graves. So the Middle Ages weren't just a time of swords, plagues, and castles. They were a mirror showing what happens when belief outruns evidence, and tradition outruns revision. The trends were deadly, but the lesson is alive, and history only becomes truly useful when we apply it, not to mock the past, but to examine the present. That's where the story really ends.